Now, as we adjust from that wonderful experience, the first now of our In Conversation panel discussions, where we're going to try to tease out a range of issues over the next 3 days, as we've really started there on learning and teaching, on governance, on Catholic identity, worship, mission. And our first panel will focus on student learning in lifting educational standards. And I welcome our panellists, the chef extraordinaire, Archbishop Anthony, and if our guests would come up, Dr. Debra Sayce is the Executive Director of Catholic Education in Western Australia. Dr. Simon Breakspear is a researcher, policy advisor and speaker on education policy, practice and change. Dr. Mary Oski is the Director of Learning and Regional Services at the Melbourne Archdiocese. And Selina Walker is a Ngunnawal woman from Canberra and Yass, and the Chair of Catholic School Parents Canberra and Goulburn. So will you please welcome them? Hi there. Look, we're going to try, it's really a good follow-on, I think, from our last segment, is how do we define and measure educational performance in these three domains that I think, you know, is enlivening faith, improving access to Catholic education, lifting educational standards, that's sort of the trifecta. And maybe this business of exploring how we define educational standards, particularly in a Catholic context, which goes to the core of it. Maybe if I start with Debra, what do you think we mean, Debra, when we talk about measuring educational performance? How are we defining success?
Yeah, thanks, Geraldine, for the lovely question, and well done to the chef extraordinaire. Maybe it is about the recipe of how to cook a souffle, but I think all of us can attest to the great focus on student outcomes in a very wholesome sort of way. And all of us can attest to the Alice Springs Declaration, which talks about two broad goals that governments have really committed to over the years. First being equity and excellence, and the second about the young person leaving schooling with a confidence in learning, being creative, innovative, courageous in their contributions. And underpinning that is also about the young person contributing to society. And Catholic Ed WA, we absolutely attest to that. And we have a vision for learning, and in describing those sort of descriptions of what the Alice Springs Declaration does, we also want, as Archbishop suggested, that chocolate flavour coming through, that Catholic worldview of their learning experience. And when we talk about young people, leaving our school system, contributing to society, the other important part is there's a motivation for that. And we'd like to think through Christian service learning, and it was wonderful that Archbishop wore his apron, because Mary McKillop said, if you see a need, do something about it. And that's what we are young people to do, not just to contribute to a society, but also have a motivation, a Christian mindset, that what they do contribute has absolute meaning and value and afford that person dignity. So in a broad brush, there are goals, there are aspirational goals, and then how do we measure that? And how do we do that in a sensible way, in a valid way? And equally, qualitative and quantitative means of assessment, I think, are really important.
Yes. And Simon, do you want to offer your thoughts there?
Yeah, well, sure. I think at the heart of when we're thinking about education, we're thinking about human development and learning in the holistic sense. And there's real limits here, of course, around measurement. But I would say that one of the problems we get into, and my whole doctorate was on PISA and international benchmarking and thinking about school performance, is we sort of dislocate this performance indicator from the very human contextual school environment community and trying to support young people. So for me, when I think about measures, I think not so much about, what are we measuring, but what's the purpose of measurement? And I think we need to move away from performance and comparison and ranking, which is what the OECD does to us internationally, what NAPLAN does as a high-stakes assessment here, and move towards measurement is about learning. Measurement's about being able to work out where we are now, such that we can make better decisions about where we go next. And I think as we remove the performativity of measurement and get into a collective learning together, then the conversation about measurement is very much asking, where are we up to, how much growth have we seen, and what can we do next? And I think that's a very different context to thinking about comparison and ranking.
So it's a means to an end, yeah. And Selina, how do you think about this?
Thank you. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people and thank them for allowing me to be here. Also want to acknowledge all my brothers, sisters, aunts and uncles that are in the room. Yeah, look, from a I guess, a parent family perspective, we measure two things, wellbeing and learning. And so, you know, there are lots of ways to measure, you know, our educational performance, and, you know, it varies. There's no middle ground here. Lots of people measure the success of their children via how well they're doing and their well-being at home and their engagement in sports and other things. You know, an unhappy kid is not a learning kid. And others measure it through your NAT plans and school reports, and any other testing means as well. And I think we have to do better to try and find that middle ground in terms of how we see and measure our kids, because, you know, we're constantly judging them, really.
Yep. That is a very nice way of thinking about it, I must say. Very nice way. Mary, what words would you use?
So I think in terms of where we start around metrics and measuring, I think where our schools have got so much data that's available to them, and I think what we've got to get better at is actually putting it together for them to make it much more accessible, and then to be working with them, because I think even what we heard this morning from our opening address from Maddie, that we should be working in partnership with our schools, and it's teachers working in partnership with their students, because for every child, we want them to reach their full potential, as we heard earlier as well. And I think even our earlier session, I was really impressed by the fact that each of those students has their own learning plan and their own goals and objectives, and that when they're not achieving them, the teacher is working with them, but also with their fellow students, and they know what it is that they're actually striving for. And when they meet those goals for themselves, there's a real sense of achievement. And you can see how wonderful that's really working at that school.
You can. But it is tricky, this, I think, Archbishop Anthony, that you say, that line you used, we're not delivering the way we did 30 years ago, we're not delivering at that level. And I think there was less individualism 30 years ago, so that there was sort of almost not quite tribal, but it was just moving out of that, I suppose, but they were sort of agreed things that everybody sort of signed up to, whether they were super happy or not. There's much more individualism now, and that's just really what, you know, you've been talking about, Mary, which is tougher for the schools, isn't it, to sort of devise, well, I think it probably is anyway, all of this very individualised sense of people's own idea of where they want to go.
It is, and this is true probably in the workplace too. People want their own hours and place of work and projects and so. That's the world we're preparing our young people for and that they come from. And so we've got to adapt to some of that. I think some of it we've got to critique as well and resist. That we have a view about the importance of the common good and importance of the whole group of kids, not just each individual, as if no one else mattered. So we're trying to raise up every kid at the same time as build a community that support and raise each other up. And so I don't think it's that we buy in entirely into the individualism of our culture, but we do recognise that's where both our young people and even many of their teachers are coming from, their families coming from, and we've got to do our best in that context. I do think too it is an opportunity to say, well, if a particular kid has a particular gift or a particular deficiency, how are we going to address that? How are we going to really help them deal with the blockage that's there, whatever it is, make the most of what's special about that kid? And we can do that without saying, oh, all the attention's going to her and everyone else is being ignored. There are ways. We have very able teachers and very committed, generous teachers, passionate teachers who I think can have an eye to the whole as well as to the individual kid.
Yes, I suppose it's interesting, you know, when you think about it, Debra, part of what you're talking about is actually with the common good, which I actually think is dead right. I think that is slightly countercultural to sort of push that, is the idea of trade-offs. So that might you say, it's a question, I don't know the answer to this, are students available for being told, look, there will be a bit of a cribbing of your desires for the sake of the common good, or at however word you wish to use it. Is that something that is worth exploring, or I presume it happens now? But
I really believe Maddie spoke so eloquently about student voice, and I'd add the word agencies, and enabling our young people to really grasp their learning and be informed by the schooling experience. And it was lovely that Lucas talked about, his own faith. So I think if we work with young people and support them to be curious, to take challenges, but to be in a supportive environment where they can take those and be courageous, because it's tough being a young person with peer pressure and all the social media and all those sorts of things, but to give them a space to find themselves and guide them along the journey. And so I do take great, what Maddie said beautifully was about the voice. Listen to them, and in that, they'll come to know themselves, they'll perhaps hopefully come to know God as well, that they'll be guided in that journey. But it's about owning that space for themselves.
But if we are to talk about lifting standards, which is part of the goals, and we've seen this 20-year decline and a widening gap of disadvantage, I mean, that's a very real and present danger for some cohorts. Rather than get into the details of all that decline, I thought maybe we should focus on what is working before we just get into throat-slitting territory. Simon, your focus is on supporting educators and leaders, I understand, to improve their practice. Where do you believe we need to focus our attention?
So if we just limit this conversation particularly to thinking about lifts in literacy and numeracy, that is an area when we talk about whether it's PISA or NAPLAN or the other data, it's something that we're all exploring. And Archbishop, as you were saying, there's contention around how we best measure it, but even using consistent measures, we are struggling. And I think there's a couple of pieces here. One is we shouldn't rush to any quick fixes. Sometimes I think about, I don't want to build on the souffle metaphor too many other times, but there are times where I go into a school that people put a lot of external capability, they try to fix the school, and it lasts for about the 10 minutes before the souffle collapses. We don't want any more quick fixes. We don't want people coming in from Catholic education diocese officers coming in and saying, we've got the solution, we can fix this on your behalf. In the end, we need self-improving schools, and no one can improve the school on behalf of the adults who live in that, who work in that building. And then what I believe we've got to actually build dynamic improvement capability. So rather than giving someone a solution to implement with fidelity, we have to build the capability to think things through in context. Here in, say, Melbourne, Mary, you've got over 330 unique contexts. So how do we think about it? I think number one, we have to help that principal working with his or her school leadership team to deeply understand the nature of the challenge. As Vivian Robinson, a terrific researcher in Auckland, says, don't start designing the future until you deeply understand the present. We're teaching reading, we're teaching mathematics, and it's not having the same impacts that we might have seen before. We shouldn't rush to, there's a package solution here, let's do it, we've got to lift NAPLAN in the next 2 years. We should say, what is going on? How do we deeply understand the nature of why we're doing this and why it's not resulting in what we want? One of the common things I find working in partnership with schools is they talk about things like teacher content knowledge. It's actually, do we have a conceptual understanding of mathematics? Do we understand the evidence base behind reading? So deeply understanding the problem, only then can you work out what evidence-informed solution might be helpful. And we have been studying this for many, many decades. And it's not about taking an evidence-based solution and telling a school to do it, but it's saying that the evidence provides us with the best bets. We should start our internal investigation within our school with that. And then the third thing is really focus on teacher expertise. Whilst we can showcase where schools have done well, that showcasing doesn't transfer the expertise. It's not too dissimilar to the cooking we've been looking at. You can watch someone do it, but it doesn't mean by watching and by knowing it's possible that I can do it. And therefore we need to put a real focus on building teacher expertise and knowledge in those specific areas. And where we've seen schools take a school-wide approach, based on evidence, learn their way to make it work and commit to 2 to 3 years on that journey, we see people
2
make
to 3
progress.
years.
The analysis for moving something like growth scores in NAPLAN is a 3 to 5 year journey. And that's why one of the things that's so important about measurement is don't just keep measuring the lagging indicators. We say they're the lagging indicators. What are the leading indicators about our knowledge, the way we're practicing, the way we're programming, the way we're assessing? And so that idea of, if we have Catholic diocesan kind of officers always just saying, we've got to move that data, it's sort of like, yeah, I know I've got to move the scales, but let's focus on the habits and the practices that if we can consistently do at a natural pace, we can move that over time.
Well, maybe, Mary, I could ask you, how do you support schools to do this?
So it is a really complex question, and I think some of the things that Simon talks about, we have been trying to implement in Melbourne. We've certainly got, we put a lot of focus also on our perception data, so we have really well evidence-based surveys for staff, students and parents, and that gives us some of those indicators around motivation, child safety, how happy they are at school. Those sort of things are really important, but also we get student reflections on teaching pedagogy and so on, and obviously from staff and parents as well. So that's a really important part of the mix. But I think putting all of that data together in an accessible way, we have been able to identify those schools that we think would benefit mostly from what we're calling now intense capacity building partnerships. And it is a new initiative for us that we've implemented this year. And we've targeted a really smaller number of schools, but to have a very intense connection with them so that we can build capability and have them, exactly what Simon was saying, really understanding what the issue is here. Is it teacher capability, or is there something else going on?
So how are you going to make sure you don't do what he says, which is that you come in and tell them how to do it?
And I think that's the second part of this, is that we have to learn as well about what is the best way of supporting our teachers and leaders in schools that actually has the biggest impact. And one of the things that we've been doing to assess that, and we've actually been doing that for a couple of years now, is at the end of each year, we have 4 regions across Melbourne, and each of them has a regional performance review at the end of the year. And they have to become really clearer about measuring the impact that they have had on that school. And it's not, you can't have lifting numeracy and literacy outcomes in 12 months. And so it's been really hard for them to grapple with, well, if we can't get a NAPLAN improvement, what impact are we expecting to have? And that has been a phenomenal growth in thinking about how we support schools. And that's an ongoing journey. But I think using what we've learnt from that process and now having these intensive capacity building partnerships, I'm really looking forward to our regional performance review at the end of this year to see where we are on that journey.
And if you had to distill it hard, what's the secret to supporting a school that's having difficulty?
I think being really clear about what impact you can have. You are not the person in the classroom teaching those students. You are not the one who has the relationship with those students. So coming back and thinking really clearly, what impact do I want to be able to have? Is it having a different conversation in the staff room about students? Is it a higher quality professional learning? Is it a higher quality collaboration within the school? So really, and in every case it will be different because the impact that you want to have on that school will vary, right? So it's taken some time and we are still learning about that, but to actually have our education consultants and so on working with schools being really clear about what impact they want to have and what impact can they have, and then how do you measure that?
How very interesting. I mean, I'm thinking as we're listening to this, Selina, where students outside metropolitan areas and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, you know, the measurements show they're definitely suffering. Do you think this would work, this type of approach coming in to helping schools?
Yeah, look, I think it would work. And, you know, when we talk about disadvantage is a very large scale.
Sure.
And there are lots of disadvantages within that scale. And so we as the adults need to look at that entire scale, not just one end or the other. You know, it's the middle curve of the bell that's being missed out. You know, the squeakiest wheel gets the most attention. All those little, you know, sayings are all still relevant now because, you know, behind every action there's an emotion, behind every emotion there's a thought. So what are our kids thinking? And that's where we need to get to as the adults. You know, with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, you know, there's so many gaps in our education around our culture. You know, where do you start? Most people are frightened to even go there for fear of getting it wrong. But if you do nothing and you say nothing, then you are accepting the status quo.
Quite.
So
you've got to be bold. That's the boldness required.
Exactly. If you don't take a chance, you're not going to make a change, right? And so, you know, the connection to country and the connection to culture and all those kind of things that you hear all the time and you just go, what does that actually mean? The only way that I can best describe it, and I get asked this question all the time, is, you know, what is your spirituality and the connection? What does it mean to you? It is like an amputated limb, right? So if a person gets their arm cut off or their leg cut off, it's not physically there, but they still feel it. They can still feel the itchy toe, right? It's constantly there. So, you know, we have to invest more in our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children's amputated limb to understand it better.
And to know how to articulate that. In this weekend Australian coverage, I don't know how many of you read it, thank you, it was a commentary on that this is about curriculum, that we're teaching in Australia too shallow and too widely and not enough depth. And this was their sort of fundamental angle, I suppose, and we'll discuss this more. But I wonder, Debra, how that hits you. Does that make sense that we're asking our teachers, we're asking our students to go too wide and too shallow and not enough depth to get that advanced thinking?
Yeah, I agree with that. You know, schools are very busy places in developing the whole child, and not enough time, and our teachers in the classroom have so much to contend with, and let alone the young person and what they bring to the level in the classroom. You know, if we have to push down a particular curriculum, that doesn't enable a young person to what brings meaning to them and how they can understand what's happening in the classroom. But if I can just touch on what Simon was saying and Selina, it is about empathy for context. I mean, we have schools throughout Western Australia, some very remote schools, East and West Kimberley. East Kimberley is a very different environment to the West Kimberley. Every school is unique. Whilst we're under the banner of Catholic Ed and we're all aspiring for, you know, to our living, you know, for the vision for learning and the Alice Springs Declaration, but there's such diverse contexts. So if, in order to meet a child where they're at, we've got to go all out to enable that to happen. But if it's too spread, then we can't concentrate on the needs of that child to support them in their learning journey. So yeah, I would agree. We're going so broad that we're not getting a depth of understanding. And if we want to talk about the Catholic worldview in our curriculum, how then do we apply this flavour of chocolate throughout the, you know, the teaching experience and the learning experience of the student?
Look, we're just going to do one more, and then we might even have time for a couple of questions about well-being, mental health. I mean, we know how much mental health issues are being reported. Mercifully, the awful predictions about suicide and suicidal ideation during the COVID did not occur, but there's constant references to the poorer mental health of young people. When we look at the individual learner's context, I mean, how do we meet their needs to get them to the point where they can learn, to get them to a sort of an equable accommodation with their state, so that they actually can receive? I mean, I know this preoccupies you, Archbishop.
Every time we've done a consultation of young adults and asked them, what are the big issues on your mind, what are the biggest concerns, what do you want the church's help with, mental health is number one, every time. Anxiety disorders, depression, and the rest. And I think one of the great things that we seek to offer our young people is a relationship with God, a God that loves them no matter what. And that doesn't make you immune to mental health challenges, but to know you are deeply loved from all eternity to all eternity has to be a help when you're navigating all the challenges of a young person in today's world. To know you have a supportive community that is there for you, people that care for you as well as a creator that cares for you. I think that a big part of the gift of Catholic education can be and should be for young people that it will be helping their mental health, which in turn will underpin all the other kind of learning issues. Now, we know many of them come from troubled family backgrounds or other challenges in their life from the social media, other parts of life that are putting tremendous pressures and sometimes brutality that they receive in the social media or wherever at home, or so the school can't do it all. It's not the fix-it for everything, but there is a lot we can do by offering them a relationship with the all-loving God and a community that will support them through life, that is the church.
Simon, how do you see this?
When I first was in education, I was a Year 12 coordinator at a school in Sydney, and I would say about 10% of my 220 students of that year group were diagnosed in some ways with an anxiety or depression disorder or both. And friends who are still in practice now would say it's now twofold. I have friends who are heads of wellbeing at large Catholic schools, and they'll say, I have to make an announcement before the mathematics result comes out in year 10 because we know we've got to be ready for. And so there are some really sort of big issues occurring, not just with the pandemic, but more broadly around a lack of resilience, a struggle with being able to work through things that many of us growing up would have said, well, that was part of life. That was the reason we went to school, was to have those experiences, to learn some of those things through. So a few things. Like for me, number one, I see resilience increasingly as a community asset, not as an individual asset alone. And I think there's a lot of the presuppositions.
And you speak about it like that, do you?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of presuppositions in psychology that's very much individualistic, that you've got to now develop the grit and resilience to be able to do this. And I think, Archbishop, what you're suggesting as well is that we're trying to knit people into community here, and that collectively we can have the resilience to do this. But of course this isn't good enough for anything that we could expect an individual to do. So I think there's nothing more relevant for the future than deep, rich human community. But when I walk past the bus stop, on the way up to the university, I'll see 8 kids, half of them will be a Catholic school uniform, and different schools perhaps going up towards where Randwick or something where I live, and they'll all be just on their phones staring at the phones. I thought, what were we doing back then? Oh, we were talking, we were introducing ourselves to someone else from another school, maybe some of the boys kicking a bag away, doing something. We were interacting. We were doing the bonds of human interaction, knitting each other together in relationships. And so, partially for me, it's about returning to the core of, I used to always say, relationships of the killer app of education. And we needed to return to that. Some of the things I think about the best way to get ready for the future, which is unknown, is to focus on things that have been most relevant for the longest time in the past, and relationships. The second thing I'd just say is we can't ask our educators to add a whole set of new programming and other things in this area. We're already talking about they're overwhelmed. And so for me, what I say to teachers that I'm working with is what we need from you now is to amplify the best quality practices. Amplify what you were already doing before in relationship, but make it more intentional. In the teaching and learning environment, amplify things like checking for understanding, using formative assessment, responding to students. I'm not asking for an extra set of things, but I'm asking you to return to some of those great relationship and teaching strategies. And I think that if you want to support students make progress from within the classroom, having experiences of making progress in their reading and their writing and their science, in their design and technology, these are some of the best ways for them to have an experience of mastery and of making progress. And that is one of the best ways we can help their well-being, to help them make progress in their learning, help them see that progress and get that uplift of development.
I was struck by Maddie saying that line, I took it down, that we have young people are uncertain. Their future seems blurred and disturbed. I thought that was very powerful, and I mean, no self-respecting teacher can remove that completely, but so yes, I was thinking about how one responded to that and what words one used, because somehow or other there's a persuasion there that the blurriness can work to their advantage, I suppose.
I would just say, I think in faith you get the broader narrative that we want to catch people up.
Yep.
There's a bigger narrative than what's just happening, in the coming decade. And then in community, you say, no matter what comes, we go together and confront that. I don't think we help anyone by saying, oh, don't worry, it's fine. But I think we catch them up in the broader narrative and then in the community that they'll approach that uncertainty. And I don't know what else we can do.
Anybody else want to comment on that in terms of how you deal with that particular sort of claim of Maddie's?
If I can just say, we've got to provide clarity and acceptance, and in that there's so much white noise in a young person's life, and we've got to make it a bit clearer for them and be present to them and listen to them. It's more listening than speaking to them. So, and the other thing, if I can add, we use a mantra of Maslow before Bloom. In order to meet the needs of a young person to learn, we've got to meet those safety, well-being needs in order for them to do the high order skills. So the more we can be attentive to where a young person's at, then we can take them on that journey, and sometimes they'll lead us in that journey as well.
Could I just add to that too? Being in Melbourne, we had 263 days of lockdown for our students over 2020 and 2021. And I don't think it will take us some time to realise the impact of that.
I agree.
I'm conscious, particularly around what Simon was saying, that our teachers in Melbourne took on a lot of health responsibilities during that time. We were checking that everyone had their masks on, vaccination levels, rat testing, providing really tough messages for parents and students and staff at the time. So the last thing I want is for them to be feeling that they're responsible now for these really significant mental health issues, which have been going on for a long time. But one of the things that has really struck us this year as our students have come back to school is some of the really fantastic things that we do as teachers in schools. For example, we have students in Year 9 that have not gone through that forming and storming stage that they do in Year 7 when they're making friendship groups. That happens naturally in Year 7 because teachers give them opportunities to get to know each other. They go on camp. They have that sorted by the time they get to Year 9. That's happening in Year 9 this year because they haven't had that experience. We have students going away on camp, and all of our teachers and schools are so keen to get our kids out on camp again. But children have had to be sent home because they're homesick, because they haven't even had stayovers at friends' houses. So in some ways I want to say to teachers and schools, come back to the basics. We're really good at doing this. We know how to have students get to know and make friends when they first start primary school and secondary school. We take them on camp, we take them on excursions for good educational reasons and for their well-being. Let's go back, remember what we do so well, and remember that as teachers, we're not mental health experts.
No.
We can connect them with those that are, but what we're really good is making children feel happy and safe and connected and to connect with each other.
Excellent. Now, look, we've just got time for a couple of questions because there are mics down the front. I can keep going, happily. But if anybody particularly wants to ask a question, I'm just trying to see where the mics are. Okay. Yes, please. To anybody. Yeah, I think. Where is the microphone? Here,
Thank you, Simon.
I was told there were two at the front.
My name is Michael Lee. I speak for the community of St Mary MacKillop College in Canberra. I respectfully suggest that Black Lives Matter, consent and respect, pride and harmony, and school strike for climate change are not expressions of adolescent individualism, but rather a powerful collective movement peopled by many, many young people that wish to improve the common good. Thank you, Selina, for your powerful observation about connection to land. I think it says a lot about the contribution that parents can make to the education of their children and to improving standards for them. My question to the panel is, how can schools do this better?
Thanks. How can schools do this better? Right. Oh gosh, look.
Distracted.
You're being interfered with this marvellous question with these fabulous looking things. Very quick answer. Very quick answer from, well...
I'll take that
yes,
one.
you go, Selina.
How can we do wellbeing and connection better?
Collective well-being better.
I think COVID, whilst it was, terrible and bad, it also brought good things. So, parents are square pegs, schools are round holes, That's what we've been battling with for the past however many years. COVID actually made us all conform to be triangles so that we actually fit. What it did was it brought the school to the home so the parents' eyes were actually opened. All families' eyes were open to what teachers and staff deal on a daily basis, right? We don't have the opportunity to be able to sit in classes, and so I think, certainly for me and for a lot of other people, it was a big eye opener. And now we're expected to go back into our square pegs and our round holes. That's not going to work moving forward. So I think we have to work together to, become hexagons.
Oh, very
Right?
good. Very good. Now,
My other thing that I wanted to say was, in terms of...
make it quick because we can't have these things dropping.
I know, there's a timer here in front of me, so, I'm black, I don't go by time, I'm always late. The other thing I wanted to say was, don't be frightened to delve into the parent engagement. We're not scary, we want to learn. And, us as adults, it's our job to nurture our children. Most of you, many of you, all of you are most likely parents or have been in some way, shape or form. We no longer have just parents raising our children, and we need to be mindful of that. They also come with experiences, they also come with, terrible traumas, and so, we have to acknowledge that as humans, and I actually think COVID did that for us. It took us back to being humans, where the well-being comes to the forefront rather than the academic standards and the pressures of that. And, yous are all heroes in my eyes because, yous were trying to raise children as well as teach children.
Yeah, that's right.
And, that is a challenge in itself. So, yeah, let's conform to hexagons.
Okay. Look, thank you. Look, I have to say I'm sorry, but this is just fabulous. I can't even pretend for a moment and not to be cool about it. It's just delicious, and it's so light and so.
Are we really going to eat in front of 1,400
Well,
people?
I think we are. I think we are. We're just going to sort of, enjoy it, and yes, be ridiculously greedy at the same time. Look, thank you very much. I think it's very difficult. These how we judge educational standards, and I can just be sort of more and more aware of how we judge it. So I want to thank the Archbishop, Debra Sayce from WA, Simon Breakspear from Research and Policy Advisor, Mary Oski, and Selina Walker. Will you please thank them very much?
And I'm just going to take this moment...
Oh, and thank the chefs, sorry.
Yes, our chefs.
Gosh! Richard and Lucas, how terrible of me. And this chef here too. Thank you very much indeed. Go on.
I'm also a member of the Catholic School Parents Australia. We do have a table up at the where the food is, so on your way, please come and say hello. And a shout out to my Canberra Goulburn colleagues that are here today. I'll see you at the table.